District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Starting Saturday, August 22nd, you can take advantage of National Park Week. From August 22nd until the 30th, it'll be the annual celebration of going to National Park Service properties, especially the 63 official national parks. I'm not sure how many listeners have gone to or visited. I talk frequently about my visits to the national parks across the years. I renewed and got another park pass. It had been a couple years since I last had it, but I figured, why not? I have some intention to visit more national parks. I went to Saguaro National Park in Arizona earlier this year when I was speaking at University of Arizona, rounding out the total of parks visited to 15 of 63. Some of you might have higher than me, which is great and commendable, and I'm envious of those of you who've been able to explore more parks or have hit all 63 parks. But I want to touch on the novelty and importance of this week, and then also touch upon, as we're speaking, things are breaking about Big Bend National Park, and I want to share some thoughts and why I think the pause in barrier construction in this border section of Big Bend National Park was the right move by the Trump administration. I'd seen some postings on it, and generally speaking, even though I've never been to Big Bend National Park, my friends who have traversed it have said there are lots of barriers, so I'll go into discussion of that. But if you want to continue America 250 celebrations, there's no better thing to do than visiting a national park, in my estimation and in my view. It's very cost effective for the most part in terms of entrance to the national parks. Each car exceeding 4 or 5, or averaging about 4 or 5 people, each passenger car. If you don't have a pass, it's about $30, $25 to $30 per site that you visit, NPS site. But if you have the park pass, you pay $80 annually, excluding kind of the processing fee. I think it's a $5 processing fee. So $85 for the whole year gets you into every single National Park Service site, over 400 sites. And all public lands, BLM and the like, Forest Service, all fit into that across agency, interagency pass. That's what is valuable, and I would say a benefit to having that. Figuring out accommodations, picking the right time, and as we're recording, it's mid-August. Most of the summer travels have already been planned, but I think the fall time, before winter sets in, especially if you're going to Yellowstone or anywhere in the Mountain West, you want to go before end of September, early October, ideally before the park shut down. If you're going to the Pacific Northwest, it gets a little rainy. No exaggeration there, but I think you could still have an enjoyable park experience through early October, mid-October there. California parks, you have all 4 seasons, or rather sunny weather all the time, so there's not really a restriction. In the mid-Atlantic, you should be able to visit Shenandoah with these, especially for fall leaf peeping opportunities. So if you're not able to visit national parks during this important celebration week, or upcoming celebration rather, you have ample opportunities in the fall time. I know gas is a little uncomfortably high with things happening outside of our control. Lodging is a little pricey in terms of supply and demand. Last minute planning, never a wise idea. But if you're able to plan, let's say for the future, especially to very popular parks, although if listeners aren't aware, Great Smoky Mountain National Park is actually the most visited national park of any, followed by, in the top 5, I just wrote about this for work. And if you're curious, you can read this on the NPS website as to what the top 5 most visited parks are. I'll share for you what that is. That would be, after Great Smoky Mountain has like about 12 million annual visitors, which is pretty high, followed by Zion in Utah, a great park. I've been there before many years ago. Yellowstone, of course, the first national park, you have to go there. In Wyoming and Montana. Grand Canyon, obviously a must visit in Arizona, and Yosemite in California. That was actually one of my first national parks in the late 90s, early 2000s that I visited with my parents in one of our early family vacations driving up from Southern California. So all of those are great parks, and there's a whole list relating to that you can find that I'll link to. And actually, if you're not aware The National Park Service logged 323 million visitors last year across all these different National Park Service properties, including national parks. And a very interesting statistic in terms of how many Americans or what percentage of Americans have visited national parks and NPS properties. I believe AAA had reported and recorded a few years ago. I'm not sure if those numbers have been updated, if they're increased or decreased. Since the reporting, this looked like within the last decade or so, about 85% of Americans have traversed at least one park annually, which is a great statistic because we often hear that Americans are not well traveled. We kind of are cocooned and we keep to our spaces. We don't really travel that much, but more and more people, especially since COVID, have started to go to national parks, and I love it. And maybe coming from the Western United States, I was used to going to public lands more, and I met a lot of people. I have a lot of friends here in the eastern part of the United States who have not gone to a lot of these iconic national parks, or they talk to me or other friends who are outdoorsy and they get inspired to plan a trip out there. So I love having that impact if I can and inspire people to travel to the parks. We have so many parks even within driving distance, give or take a day driving distance. If you're going to Smoky Mountain, again, the most popular park annually visited, but you can go to Shenandoah within 2.5 hours of Washington, D.C., very easy to access. There is the New River Gorge National Park in West Virginia. I have not been there. I've heard great things about it. And if you're coming to Washington, D.C. or have visited for America 250 festivities, and this weekend I will be able to report back to you next week my experience with the Grand Prix. And why am I mentioning the Grand Prix? It's adjacent to a lot of National Park Service, National Mall properties, and that'll be super cool. We haven't had a Grand Prix or professional race like that ever in DC, so I'll report back my findings, but it's adjacent to national parks. Figure that's why I can insert it into the podcast. But Washington, D.C. has a lot of National Park Service land sites, including the National Mall, including Rock Creek Park, including a lot of the fountains that I mentioned, the aforementioned fountains that have been repaired at Union Station, at the various different parks that I've alluded to in downtown and the surrounding regions, a lot of beautification projects. So you can't escape a National Park Service site. There's 433 sites all across the country in the lower 48 and also in Hawaii and Alaska as well. And both of those states actually have a lot of properties. Alaska has a lot of national parks too. This year's National Park Week theme is Celebrate America's Story. So no better opportunity than to rediscover, let's say, love of rugged individualism, maybe tap into your natural senses for the first time. Because surprisingly, a large amount of Americans still have not gone to national parks. But I'm optimistic, or I'm confident that a lot more people are. In the age of social media, a lot of people are exploring these places, hopefully respectfully, and they're leaving no trace. We've often talked about the campaign to leave no trace, like you leave it better than you found it. Of course, you always want to be respectful, and there have been instances since we've had this podcast over the last 8-9 years of having this show. We've reported on incidences of people defacing public lands, which is unacceptable. You shouldn't do that. So if you are going for the first time, or if you don't know the protocol or what you can do, can you take and remove things? No, you can't in national parks especially. Leaving a place better than you found it is also really important to hone in on. So when you're going there, please be respectful, of course, because you don't want to lose privileges of going to places or to shut down access for everyone if you're ruining and defacing things. But for the most part, I would say Americans tend to be respectful of public lands. They could always improve upon themselves. Nevertheless, it's always good to remind people, and I try to encourage that myself when I'm going to parks or if I'm talking about public lands and access and maximizing that for everyone. But always having some sort of like decorum and respect is very important. So listeners are pretty well behaved. Our listeners here listen, but sometimes you can't reach people, and people don't want to listen and will, go in their own way. And I can't influence every single person. That's out of my control. But I can encourage people who are open-minded, and I think most people already have this ingrained in their minds, just to be respectful. That's what you have to do. It's common sense. I want to touch on one of the three parks as well, as we're talking about National Park Week. Today's story, as I'm recording this, it's later in the afternoon of August 17th. But as I was planning out my show notes and show topics, I wanted to touch on this very quickly. And this is not a criticism necessarily of the administration, but I had seen the story pop out and start to gain more traction. I'd seen a lot of conservative friends in Texas start to sound the alarm of their concerns about this. What am I alluding to here? The Big Bend National Park. There had been videos documented of certain construction crews going into very difficult to traverse areas of Big Bend National Park. And there was controversy over proposed barrier construction in that very difficult to access region of Big Bend National Park. It's a very, very large park, I believe over 1 million acres. It is situated on the border. There is in terms of where it's located, it's part of the 517-mile section, Big Bend River section. Not all of the park, to my knowledge, I think is encompassed with that, but maybe a good chunk of it is. But the controversy over this was, should you be putting a barrier in a place that is already naturally defensive against any people that go there? I'd watched this documentary about the wall. And so you'd seen a Texas congressman, Democrat and Republican, this was maybe a decade ago, close to a decade ago, arguing against the border wall construction there. And I watched it with an open mind to see, like, okay, what are they arguing? I'm someone who supports border security, but I was curious, like, okay, why is this documentary getting hype? And when I watched it, they even made the argument that it's difficult to build a wall there. And I think at the time in Trump 1.0, the admin officials had said, like, yeah, we're not exploring anything there. It's extremely difficult terrain to access. Like, it's even hard for animals to migrate, too. It's just naturally dangerous to go there, and illegal immigrants are not crossing that section of the border. And in fact, what is super interesting, border crossings in that sector have decreased about 74% in the last year, which is a testament to border security. So that's great. But if you're looking at an area where you want to, and border crossings illegally, especially on public lands, are significantly down since the Trump admin has gone into effect back in for the second term. And that's a thing to celebrate. Like, I think a lot of people overlooked and glossed over the fact that a lot of illegal crossings had damaged public lands. And I was very curious about this, and I was asking certain questions, like, why did people turn a blind eye to destruction of public lands under the Biden admin? There was a lot of areas that were trashed, destroyed. I'm thinking there was a lot of animals poached too, possibly some endangered animals. Maybe we'll find out that there were some endangered animals or imperiled species that were threatened under illegal immigration, but you never really can get a concrete answer from Democratic administrations. They say that only the border wall is invasive and dangerous. And again, I think you can have more nuance in this case where it's already a natural barrier in the park, and hopefully one day I could see for myself. But from what my friends have testified to, who've been to Big Bend, and like Big Bend, it's very difficult to build anything. It's even difficult to drive and access. So why would they build a barrier there? Not sure. But because the backlash, which was bipartisan, was so robust, so almost universal, we saw today earlier in the afternoon that U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Rodney Scott had issued a video statement saying that they've paused construction in Big Bend National Park over this barrier project. And this is what his official statement was. CPB is pausing all construction activity in Big Bend National Park while I visit and conduct a personal on-the-ground evaluation. CBP is firmly committed to protecting America, and that includes our national treasures like Big Bend National Park. We know the current and predictable national security threats, and they are real. Now, over the next couple of days, I will join a small team to evaluate the terrain and listen to local leadership, community members, and stakeholders to ensure that we will secure our borders while simultaneously protecting Big Bend National Park for generations to come. So I think that's a reassuring message. I think the commissioner had said something to the effect that, like, he wants the project to proceed, but every administration, right or left, always responds to public pushback. And I think they're in the right here to do it as well. Like I said, I didn't even touch how much of border crossings were here. So historically speaking, very few illegal immigrants would come through this sector of the border. So it's about 1 to 1.3% of activity. And border crossings at this section, which expands beyond Big Bend National Park, to my understanding, down significantly, 74%. So if it's 1 to 1.3% of illegal crossings, that seems very minuscule and not a wise place to prioritize border fencing. And you can debate, elsewhere, maybe where it's less sensitive to put border fencing. And I think it's appropriate in most other sections that don't border a national park or public lands. But I think it's very similar to the insertion of the sale of public lands. I did not agree with that provision in the One Big Beautiful bill. I thought that was a poison pill. And you can debate whether or not, there are some rare exceptions where you can but transfer public lands. It's been done in Las Vegas. It's debatable whether or not you should do it on housing grounds. I don't really buy that argument because we have a lot of housing inventory in urban areas that need attention. You can buy this. So there's not a scarcity of housing. It's actually plentiful housing. So that was the argument that was being made. It was a bad argument. That's why it was not inserted into the What Would Be Beautiful bill. And any standalone efforts are and have been rejected by both Republicans and Democrats. So I think it's very similar to that failed action, where it's a really, really minority position, or it's like a minuscule area that's not really problematic, where focusing your efforts or prioritizing this section makes no sense, where other areas might be deserving of more attention for border security fence. And that's why I think they relented and paused the project. And I think, again, that was the right move here with Big Bend National Park, because these areas are supposed to be off limits, and they are historically, some parks are mismanaged. They have infrastructure problems. They have so many different issues, and they can. And actually, funny enough, and interestingly enough, the admin, a lot of people give them criticism, but I've seen even beyond the headlines and some of the outrage that have been awarded to them, that they have been prioritizing access, even with some little missteps like this, where they do want buy-in from the community. They want buy-in from the public. And you have seen improvements. Secretary Burgum has showcased this on his social media, that Yosemite, other national parks have increased their access. They've made infrastructure improvements from the Great American Outdoors Act. I argue very frequently here on the show and in my work at Independent Women, our Center for Energy and Conservation, that you can have production, you can have ag, you can have energy, you can have mining, but you also need to have, and you should be able to have, recreation, access, conservation. This is where administrations have to delicately balance. We don't want too much overdevelopment, which is a pretty minority position even among conservatives and Republicans. We have to constantly remind some individuals that you don't want to always be seen as hating of public lands. That's a very toxic position to have. It's not very smart to have that position in the Mountain West, especially in traditionally Republican states like Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and the like. Alternatively, rewilding, as we've talked about at length here on the show for the past several years, and we will continue to dedicate time to those very questionable campaigns. It's very antithetical to conservation. The Biden administration was very seeped into this rewilding philosophy. So conservation is a balancing act here. I think you can have multiple uses. We should still incline ourselves to multiple uses. That's what FLIPMA and our conservation ethos argues for. So it's always going to be a push and pull. And I think that's why National Park Week is very important to emphasize and promote. And also this story relating to Big Bend kind of highlights the tensions of what's at stake. Like, you need to preserve national parks, absolutely. We also need to have the infrastructure and maintenance and enhancements to the parks in order and in keeping access and not destroying the national parks, because those are supposed to be off limits. Always a balancing act. It's sometimes difficult to toe the line, but I think either extreme on the conservation pendulum doesn't work. So I think you take things by case basis, but you also have to recognize that attacking public lands is not a very suitable position to have if you're a conservative, which is why we try to argue that here on the program. And like I said, even with how sometimes imperfect administrations can be, I will say I am largely impressed and supportive of the initiatives that this administration has undertaken. Is it always going to be perfect? No, but do we want to have people and stakeholders that we can reason with? You can reason with this admin. Like, they relented on the project at Big Bend. Could you say the same of the Biden administration? Absolutely not. Like, unless something really, really was super outrageous. But most of the time, they just adopted their projects and agenda without listening to criticism. But the Trump administration listens, and the public scrutiny that was being placed to Big Bend, that had a lot of negative implications, and the social media attention was not ideal. I hope you find your park this upcoming week. Go to a national park site. It'll still be tangentially related and close, over 430 properties. And I would love to hear what you guys are all up to. So feel free to continue to engage on social media, personally on my accounts or on the podcast accounts. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played. And also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day. and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.